Hi.
Hi.
Okay, so let's talk about your paper here. And okay, so let me save it again in case I make some more changes. Save as. Oh, I already made the change. I already did that. Okay. So all right. So your English is already wonderful, and in
hmm
terms of what I can do in terms of offering resources to you that help get some additional benefit. I can just suggest how I, as a native speaker, would might phrase things in order to,
Right.
and also to introduce all the students to these academic writing style requirements for scholarly
Yeah.
social science research. And so I start off by saying, avoid using first person because that's typically, like I was just talking with T-Man, right? That scholarly writing, you make true statements and then you prove them.
Yeah.
So when you use first person, I, me, mine, we, why, us, you're reminding the scholarly reader that the scholarly reader is not reading a true statement. The scholarly reader is reading one individual person's impressions or beliefs rather
Right.
than arguing and defending a true statement, right?
hmm
So that's why I always tell students that you don't need to say in my opinion or I think or I believe. You don't just make your truth, and you're going to find when you do that it will also cut down on the wordage. I mean,
Right. Yeah.
you want to make that 550 word requirement, and I'm doing that partly because it's like I tell all the students I have to write papers too, and I have to follow all the same rules I'm suggesting here, and I have to meet word limits typically as well. And when you have a word limit, you have to know exactly what you're trying to state in order to write it as concisely and succinctly as possible, which means you have to really crystallize your thoughts,
Yes.
and that means articulate them. And so that's why I'm kind of a stickler about that word limit issue. Um, Otherwise, it's not so much an issue for Korean students because I think it might be because English is so different from Korean language that Korean students, when they write in English, they
hmm
already have to think exactly how they're going to say something in English because it's not easy. You can't just slip
Yeah.
from, unless you're born and raised maybe in US as a Korean, it's bilingual. You can't just slip back and forth. But like Europeans, because English has got elements of, it's an Indo-European language. It's not that different from German and French and it's got that. It's just too easy for people who are native, basically native equivalency speakers like you or me, just basically to blah, spill out whatever we want. Whereas
Yes.
Koreans, after, they can't do that because it's too hard. It's English is more difficult for them. So and so that's why the word limit also is important, because it really
Right.
makes people go back and what is the exact point I'm trying to argue, and what is the evidence I'm going to use to support it, rather than, this is basically what you wrote. What you sent me is like a first draft. It's a first draft of
hmm
your paper. I mean, that's what
Yeah.
I do too. I write papers because I have to write papers too. Like I said, I write down my ideas, my brilliant ideas. Oh yes, yeah. And then I spend weeks and months, literally months, going over them, refining them, doing the literature survey, literature searches to find academic scholarly literature to
Yeah.
support any claim I make. I have to support with evidence. I can't even say without evidence that the United States won the Cold War. I can't say that. If unless I can say it, but I have to find evidence to support it.
hmm
And that might not be too hard to find because there are people, but that's any statement that we make in social sciences is probably controversial. So even if
Right.
I support it with evidence, people might not believe it, but you have to try. But I mean, for example, how do you define democracy? You think that's an old concept. It's been around for a long, long time. Surely everybody, no, people don't agree on what the definition of democracy is. I mean, they're
Mm.
a political scientist. How do you define the state? What is the state? And,
Yeah, I
and
think
so
I
the
think
definition
actually.
sorry, what's that?
Oh, sorry to interrupt you, but I think I probably misused the word state because I mentioned in one of my arguments that China would probably be a failed state like the USSR.
Uh-huh.
But you said that USSR was like only 50% Russian,
Uh-huh.
which I totally agree. But actually, I didn't mean it in that way. I meant it more of, so the USSR collapsed because of wanting to have independence, and economically, it wasn't really stable. And I think that's one of my arguments, that even if China would be a democracy, I think only Beijing would really benefit from that.
There's a lot in what you just said, because this has been a source of controversy for decades. Like, people compare what reforms in the Soviet Union began in the mid-1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev, when he became General Secretary of the Communist Party, and versus the reforms that began in China several years earlier under Deng Xiaoping, when he was General Secretary of the Communist Party of China. And why did China succeed in carrying out economic reforms and not disintegrating as a state, whereas the Soviet Union tried to carry out reforms, and the Russian words were perestroika, which is rebuilding or restructuring, and glasnost, which means transparency. And some of the claims, including the people that were advising their different communist and post-communist rulers, they said you can't really compare so easily the Soviet Union with China, because the Soviet Union was already an industrialized state. So if you're going to carry out economic reforms there, you needed to change the political system to allow people to express different points of view regarding, for example, how to manage different economic enterprises in an complex industrialized society in which there is going to be disagreements about how you manage this steel factory, or how you manage this aerospace factory, or this business, or how you're going to manage this agro-industrial complex, and that means you need to have more contribution, at least by the people within their enterprises. The way, for example, the president of a company, the president of a company, or the president of this university, or the president of a university in Belgium, they got to get feedback from the people that they supervise. If they don't get feedback, inaccurate feedback, they're not going to, their ability to make effective policies is going to go way down. And the problem in a communist totalitarian state is that or you are suspicious, if you're somebody in that state, that if you say something that the boss doesn't want to hear, the boss might punish you, because the boss doesn't face immediate consequences of a failure to carry out effective reforms, because in state socialism, under communism in the Soviet Union, you didn't have an economic market. You didn't have a market of competitors you're competing against to sell your products and make more money that would punish you because you make a bad or inferior or product with bad businesses. You didn't have that in the Soviet Union. So you needed to create a market, which you needed at least some degree of democracy participation, so that people can get into the habit, or at least in the practice of not maybe at the level of the worker, but or that's important maybe to form trade unions, but for example, the top levels of these organizations where, you have disagreements about how you run the organization. People disagree, they argue about it, and they make a decision, and the people that lose don't get punished, or they might get punished, they might have to quit. But that's not, your personal well-being is not at stake.
Right.
So that's always the claim that was made, that you had to have some degree of political reform, more significant political reform in the Soviet Union, because it was a more complicated socioeconomic system than in China, which was still overwhelmingly agrarian when Deng Xiaoping took power. I think I read something like 80% of the population, or if not more, were farmers still in China in 1979. So, and so but there was always that hope that as the Chinese therefore developed, as they industrialized, as they became a modern industrialized society with high tech and advanced factories, that they would also have more and more pressure for democratization to happen there. And that was supposedly one of the arguments that was made for bringing China to the World Trade Organization. I think in 2001, China came in the World Trade Organization. And that would lead to, sort of like what happened here in South Korea, that the claim is often made that South Korea democratized in part because it became an industrialized modern society. And, dictatorship is not really efficient for making your national economy effective if it's so overwhelmingly dependent upon exports and providing, as a modern industrialized society that exports high value added complex products, not just oil and gas like Saudi Arabia, but, computers, cell phones, cars, right? And that was supposed to happen in China, the way it supposedly happened in South Korea and in Taiwan, the Asian tigers, right? And now people are questioning whether or not that, in fact, if that's the case, that China is going to, so what is the United States supposed to? So I guess to go back to what I was arguing here, do you think that China must democratize, become more like the United States for there not to be conflict? That if China did democratize, let's say, oh God, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where, how would they do this? And I just can't imagine it happening. I mean, before you were born, there was the Tiananmen Square protest in 1989, where all these college students and others came protesting in the main central square in Beijing, wanting democracy and, making a statue that looked like the Statue of Liberty in the United States, their Statue of Freedom, whatever. And then the Deng Xiaoping sent in the army and killed, we don't know how many hundreds, if not thousands of people. They've covered it up. But you probably heard of it, the Tiananmen Square massacre.
Yeah.
They wanted and there were elements in the Communist Party and in the top leadership of the Communist Party that were sympathetic. They wanted that changes. They wanted these reforms, and those people were all kicked out, shut out by Deng Xiaoping. Put under house arrest. I don't think anybody was executed at the top level. So how would democratization happen in China today? Is it going to be peaceful or is it going to be violent?
No.
But I guess the question is, do you think even if China democratized, that there would be more peace between America and China?
Honestly, I think not looking into deep, well, like let's say like Russia, for example, or even Ukraine or one of the Baltic countries, right, who are democratized. There's so much things that just aren't being disclosed that happen because of their corruption, right? I think that would happen as well in China. They would be democratized. The relations would on paper be like, oh, we are friendly. Yes, we're doing this and that. But what's actually happening with the people is totally different.
I appreciate your comments because, that's one of the arguments made about arguing for a containment policy against Russia as it puts pressure on Ukraine. That supposedly Putin is threatened, but his regime and his rule is threatened in Russia if Ukraine or Belarus become successful democracies. Now, Belarus is under a dictator who's been there since, quasi-dictator since he's been there since 1994, Lukashenko. But if Ukraine becomes a successful democratizing state that joins NATO and the European Union, because of its close ethnic and civilizational and religious ties to Russians, that it's going to become an inspiration model to other Russians who will protest more strongly against and resist the quasi-authoritarian regime of Putin's Russia, Russia. So, does that apply to China? Let me defend the Russian argument. The Russian argument that you read today in the New York Times is, for example, that Russia believes, as I said earlier in some other classes, right, that Ukraine is an artificial state. If anything's a failed state, that's a failed state. That's a state that was only created by Lenin and Stalin in the 1920s, who created artificial boundaries between Russia and Ukraine that were never there before under the Tsar's regime. and for a number of reasons, including a desire to reduce the political dominance of the Russians, because the Russians were 50% of the population, and that was going to always be a problem in persuading people through terror and coercion, but also through persuasion, to accept the Soviet Union, because they were always going to be suspicious that the Soviet Union was basically just another version of the Russian Empire with a different socialist Marxist face. And so you had to break up the Russian Empire into 15 different republics, and we'll make Ukraine a republic, and Belarus a republic, and Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan. Those borders were all drawn in the 1920s. They were never put there by the Tsar. And so the point I'm trying to make is that from the Russian perspective, if you allow NATO and European Union to exploit those borders by letting Ukraine join NATO and European Union, it's undermining what it means to be Russian. Because from the Russian idea and mentality, as you might know, if you speak Russian, right? Ukrai means frontier, at the frontier. That's just called the frontier lands in English, if you would translate Ukraine, right? It means frontier lands. It's like, well, you live in Belgium. It's like the low, like what do you call it in Italian? The Pays Bas, the low countries. It's a geographical designation.
Yeah.
It was never an ethnic. Now, if you're a Ukrainian nationalist, you probably want to punch me in the nose for saying that. Because
I'm not really.
You go to Wikipedia and they'll say, "Oh, no, we had a glorious golden era hundreds of years ago. We had our own separate Ukrainian state," and they'll try to make that argument. But maybe, and they'll make themselves believe it. But but the Russians don't believe it. And,
right? No, of course not.
And so, if you allow NATO and European Union to take Ukraine, you're basically dissolving Russia.
Yes. And that's also an interesting thing to think about, like what would happen, how would Russia react? But
since we only have 12 minutes, but back to China, is China really concerned about being dissolved? If Taiwan becomes recognized as a sovereign independent state, this little country of 21 million people on an island, China will be dissolved. They might argue that it already would, because I think from the Chinese point of view, different Chinese have different points of view. First off, I shouldn't say the Chinese point of view, but the dominant point of view is that the China used to be much bigger than it is now, but only relatively recently has been chopped up, like Mongolia. I mean, Genghis Khan was from Mongolia. He conquered China. They were all one part of the Chinese empire. And then when China was weak, the bad Russians intervened to strip Mongolia away from the Chinese empire. So they have no love for the Russians historically as well. Everything west of Lake Baikal, they believe was part of the Chinese empire. The Indochina, what is Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia, that used to be part of the Chinese empire. And the South China Sea is called the South China Sea because it was part of China. And the Americans say, well, we call the Gulf of Mexico, but that's not considered to be Mexican territory. And the Chinese would say, well, yeah, because you conquered half of Mexico in the 1840s. Yeah, that's why Gulf of Mexico is not Mexican. And that's not going to happen to China. So, I mean, maybe in that sense, and that becomes part of the self-justification for the totalitarian rule of the Communist Party in China, that we are tasked, and this is an argument for fascism, that it could be becoming an authoritarian populist regime, that we have to exercise totalitarian control at home because we're still carrying out our mission to rebuild China, to get China on its knees and make China what it had been for hundreds, if not thousands of years, a center of the world. And if we democratize, what's going to happen. What they did in the past, they're going to encourage the Tibetans to rise up. They're already encouraging the Uyghurs to rise up, and to weaken and divide us. And it's not going to happen. But, and that's why a liberal would say, from the three different perspectives, realist, liberal, and constructivist paradigmatic perspectives in international relations, the liberals would say, yeah, the nature of the political system is important for peace between these two countries, because the Chinese Communist Party is always going to be threatened by liberalism and democracy on its borders elsewhere, because it's going to always be an alternative model. Now, if that's the case, I don't see why there wasn't, there was a newspaper report about how the world is really suffering because Chinese tourists are not coming to Europe because of the COVID, right? So all these Chinese tourists have been coming and spending their money in Belgium and Italy and France. And, I don't see them going back to China and challenging the political system because, we were in Belgium. We saw a vibrant democracy there. I don't see that happening.
No. Yeah.
But a realist might say, hey, the nature of the political systems is really of secondary importance. I mean, the fact is you have a world that's dominated by the United States in terms of American power and American influence over you and me and our brains and our thinking and our worldview. And Americans like that because Americans are nationalists, and that's what human beings like that. And realists have a kind of negative, melancholy view of human nature. We like to influence and control and dominate people just for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And then China is becoming more and more powerful, more and more power because of economic development. And so China, of course, is going to, like other human beings, they're going to want to have more and more influence over you and me and the rest of the world. And that means they're going to have to take influence away from Americans.
Right.
And America's going to resist. And it doesn't matter if it's a communist regime, if it's a monarchy, if it's a democracy, Americans are going to resist. They're going to see a threat, they're going to see a danger, and they're going to oppose it. Just like, for example, like I was talking with T-Man, right? There's all these comparisons being made today with, say, the rise of Germany in the late 19th century challenging the British Empire at the late 19th century. So the Americans are like the British Empire over 100 years ago. And you got China, which is sort of like Germany, supposedly. But like how different was Germany from Great Britain in culture and politics? They had elections in Germany. They had multi-party parliamentary elections. The German parliament had to approve the budget, for the military. Now, I know the Kaiser controlled the military, but it was a Christian country. The Kaiser was related in the same family as the rulers of Britain. So how different in terms of political system were the Germans from the British? Not much.
Not much.
And they still fought World War I.
Yeah.
Now, Britain still saw a threat from Germany. So, so that's what a realist would point out. And that's what they do point out, that, it's inevitable that there is going to be escalating conflict. What we have to do is to manage the conflict to make sure that it doesn't lead to accidents, because nobody wants to fight a nuclear war, right?
No.
But accidents can happen. I mean, you can see how they happen. Like, for example, when a few years ago, when somebody pushed the wrong button in Hawaii, when Trump is saying, I'm going to nuke North Korea if they dare to nuke us or whatever, and somebody pushed the wrong button in Hawaii and sent out an SMS message to everybody's cell phone in the state of Hawaii that a missile was incoming, a ballistic missile.
Right.
And fortunately, all of the thousands of people employed in the military, somebody didn't screw up and panic and do something that would have required the Chinese or the North Koreans to respond.
Yeah.
And those accidents, sooner or later, they happen.
Definitely.
Like when the Americans accidentally bombed the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. When they had old maps, they didn't know that the Chinese embassy had moved to this building. They thought it was something else, and they bombed and killed 3 Chinese diplomats.
Wow.
The Simpson moment. That kind of stuff always happens. So you try to keep your conflicts indirect. You compete by appealing to other countries to invest and participate in your economic trade relationships. In terms of what the so it basically is, you think that there's the threat of nuclear war, the intense economic integration of China into the global capitalist economy, unlike the old Soviet Union, China's intense integration of global capitalist economy, and global climate change and the challenges of the pandemic are going to basically produce a fundamentally different kind of competition between US and China compared to what the US had in competition with the Soviet Union. True or no?
Yeah,
Yes or no? Yeah.
I truly think so, because all of these factors are more in line with worldviews. Well, let's say not the totalitarian control, but I think China will have a significant impact just on the global, on a global level, being climate change, being the economy, being all of these factors. They impact so much on a world level, whilst okay, communism of course did as well. Let's not undermine that, because if what would happen if communism had spread throughout the whole planet, throughout every country, we don't know what would have happened. But I think I don't think honestly, I don't believe that China's intention is to spread communism. I think they have their own beliefs. And I think if they want to prosper even more, because if you look at it, China's been really only a country that has got a lot of significance on the world level for the past maybe 5 decades.
Uh-huh.
So if you look at it in that sort of way, you can see that China's really trying to better themselves. And do you think by getting into conflicts a lot and being like, okay, this is what we're going to do, like Russia did, and we're going to implement it to everywhere, I don't think that will happen.
Uh-huh.
Honestly speaking, I think that yes, maybe a democracy will help. I'm not too sure. I think it would help if, at the end, as a result of them, of the countries who are saying like, oh, look at how the totalitarian control is really bad. Oh, they're so different. So let's make them similar so we aren't afraid of them.
Well, I mean, do you think maybe the United States might become more like China, as China, dealing with climate change, that U.S. could become more like Putin's Russia, that's quasi-dictatorship. It's still formally a democracy, but it's not really democracy. That Donald Trump gets reelected in 2024, or somebody like Donald Trump, and basically the United States moves in a more authoritarian kind of direction.
The problem with the United States, I feel like, is it is so dependent on what the people believe at that time.
Uh-huh.
Because people change very quickly and they get very fast. How do you say it in English? Well, their mindset changes very quickly, right?
Fickle.
As you can see, yeah, they're gullible, or is that the right word?
Fickle, gullible.
Yeah, they're very fickle, and I think that's the problem with the US.
Uh-huh.
Yes, you have the American dream, whatever, and they have quite a lot of influence around the world. But like recently, Donald Trump, it could happen again at any time, just because people believe in it, and because of the crisis that we're currently in still with COVID, and now that Omicron is here, I don't think COVID will be gone pretty soon. I think people will be more gullible and more influenceable because of the crisis that's going on. And I think at every time that there's going to be a crisis, just having a bad leader could eventually be like a Putin, or because of their own beliefs, right? Like how Trump said, oh, climate change, yeah, that's just Chinese bullshit. Sorry for saying it like that, but that's how he basically portrayed it. He said, no, I don't believe in it. And then he said, oh yeah, let's just not deal with them, so the import tariffs will go up, basically saying whatever he wanted to. Which if you think about, is really scary, because as you said, everybody's influenced by the US pretty much. Well, there's an influence somewhere, right? Because the US helped win the Cold War. They have these relations with so many countries. So it could always become a dictatorship in my personal view.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Well, that's about it then. I don't think we made any changes to, my comments on the paper. So that's it. I'll send you the link then to
Mhm.
the session, okay? Once I
Okay,
upload to YouTube. Okay,
thank
bye.
you. Bye.